Hello, my name is Grant Van Vranken. Today we're going to talk about my 6 times great-grandfather, a man named Peter Wylie. One of the neat things about Peter is we actually have his christening record in Philadelphia at the First Presbyterian Church. He was listed as the son of John Wylie. He was born October 12th, 1740, and that he was christened on the 29th of October. In that same church register listed his parents' marriage on the 3rd of October, 1738. His mother's name was Catherine Chambers. He had an older brother named John, younger siblings Alexander, Mary, Thomas, and Elizabeth. Also listed in the First Presbyterian Church Register is a February 6th, 1717 marriage of Samuel Chambers to Mary Wainwright, and it's the only Chambers family that would be about the right age to be Catherine's parents. And there's no other record of any other Chambers family living there that I can find that she would fit into. So further exploration should be made into this line because they're actually pretty fascinating. The Wainwright side, they end up being in Bermuda for quite a while, and I'd like to find out more about that to see if that is indeed our line. Well, we're not sure exactly when the Wileys moved to Virginia, but it is known that John Wylie had started purchasing land from Benjamin Borden by November of 1743 when his will was presented for probate. And that was proven in 1747 when Benjamin's son, also named Benjamin, made a deed for 390 acres to John in Augusta County, stating that he had uh, made a contract with his father to purchase this land, and his father died, so he was now making good on this contract. And then John actually purchased at least 2 more tracts from him. Peter Wylie came of age in around Augusta County, Virginia, as the French and Indian War was raging. And we know for sure from records that he did serve along with his brother John, and they both received 50 acres of land for it in 1780. But he states that he served under Captain Dickinson and that they had gone to Fort Young to relieve the men there. Well, the good news is they know for sure when Captain Dickinson actually went to Fort Young, and that was September 14th, 1758. So there you go. We know exactly when he was there. And Fort Young was a palisaded fort that stood near the Jackson River, and it was probably one of the frontier forts that George Washington, as colonel of the Virginia militia, had visited in 1756 when he did a tour of a bunch of the forts. Um, Fort Young, or Dickinson's Fort, whatever you want to call it, was garrisoned through the end of the Revolutionary War, but it had all but disappeared by 1850 or so. So Peter likely did a lot of various different types of service because of where his father lived. They were under Indian attack. They got the neighbors got killed October 10th, 1759. 10 to 12 of them were killed, 13 were captured. Captain John Dickinson, who Peter had worked for, his company, along with Captain Charles Lewis, pursued the Indians. They killed 20 and recovered the POWs. Um, John and Agnes Gilmore got killed, and tragically, their son would die in 1764 in another attack, and his wife and 3 children were taken captive. But the Indian chief leading some of these attacks was Cornstalk, who I've spoken about before. He was involved in some attacks around Fort Pitt, and also he was one of the main leaders at the Battle of Point Pleasant in what's now West Virginia in 1774, where my 7 times great uncle Samuel Crowley was killed. And there's a drawing of him down at the bottom. And then somewhere around this time, Peter married Mary Sharkey. And there's no record of their marriage, but there was a document relating to a land gift made by Patrick Sharkey, who was Mary's father, and his friend, I believe it was Robert or James Montgomery, I can't remember which. And they had donated, I believe it was 85 acres to the Presbyterian Church at what's now Fincastle, Virginia. And it ended up being surveyed many, many years later, and it stated that it was more acres than they thought it was, which was very common back then. The early surveys were terrible. And so the congregation sued the heirs, and it mentioned Mary, wife of Peter Wylie. So we know for sure that she was married to Peter Wylie. And there were only a couple Peter Wylies floating around, so we know this is her. But anyway, her father, Patrick, lived in Botetourt, or however you pronounce that county, and he owned 1,300 or so acres along with his wife Ann Looney, whose family was well known in the area. And he had a hemp farm and hemp mill at the Locust Bottoms on the James River. And Patrick's son-in-law, Adam Peck, was actually the grandson of Benjamin Borden. And his mother and her heirs were not happy with the way that estate was settled, and they sued over that property from that estate until the 1880s. So Peter and his brother Alexander bought 400 acres of land in Augusta County from their father August 19th, 1765 for 200 pounds. It was probably pretty close to when both of them had gotten married and were starting their families. And then in April of 1769, the brothers and their wives, both named Mary, sold 150 acres of that tract to Henry Stafford for 60 pounds. And they also sold 100 acres back to their father for 50 pounds and 5 shillings. And he would hold on to that land for another 20 years, not selling it until August of 1789 to a guy named John Grills, and he sold it for 255 pounds, which to me sounds like a lot of money at the time. I'll have to look into that more. And then John held on to it until 1797, and he sold it for 350 pounds. And at this time, it was considered in Montgomery County, Virginia, because the lot lines moved, or county lines moved, and it wasn't uncommon for some of the land that the Wileys lived on to end up being in 3 different counties, but they never even moved. Also in 1769, Peter was listed in I believe it was a lawsuit of some kind, and he deposed that Peter Cochran stayed at his house on the way to the Halston River. And it was something about horses and selling a stolen horse or something like that. But Peter just stated the guy stayed at his house and was there a little bit. And then In 1780, Peter and Mary, Alexander and Mary sell 170 acres on the east side of New River for 208 pounds to John Taylor. And I'm kind of confused here because if you add up 170 and 100 and 150, that's more than 400 acres. So I don't know how they were able to do that unless it was like that other gift that I was talking about Patrick Sharkey had made where like when John gave his or sold 400 acres to his kids, maybe it was actually more than 400 acres and they found out later. But at that point, they moved and they were starting their journey down to Georgia. Now, it appears that Peter made several trips back and forth because there's some land down in Georgia, but then there's records back in Virginia, such as April 1782 when he was paid 35 shillings for a blanket impressed by the Greenbrier militia on their way to Kentucky. I love the way they spelled it in 1781. Um, and then he did appear, like I said, in Botetourt County or Augusta County in the militia during the French and Indian War. This was a pretty neat document that I was able to find. Um, it states that in August 1790, one bay mare and saddle, and then in September 1790, one bay horse were stolen from John Wylie, and Peter, and we're going to assume this is his brother John, because his father was in, I want to say he was in Lincoln County, Kentucky by this point. Anyway, John ended up moving down to Georgia with Peter, and he's stating that these horses were stolen by the Creek Indians and that the value of the one bay and bay mare in the saddle was $93.50 and the other horse was worth $24.50. July 18th, 1785, Peter obtained a patent to 400 acres of land in Franklin County, Georgia. And I'm not sure if he ever actually lived on it or if it was just kind of like land speculation. Because on April 6, 1790, he purchased 50 acres from David Campbell for 60 pounds in Rockbridge County, Virginia. And for that small of acreage and that price, I would imagine it had to have had a house on it. I wouldn't imagine it was anything all that spectacular, but it had to have had a house and probably some outbuildings, maybe some cleared land, because that was a pretty decent amount of land, amount of money for 50 acres back then. Anyway, he was on the Franklin County, Georgia census in 1790. And then in 1792, they sell the 50 acres in Rockbridge County to Jacob Keebler for 70 pounds. So he was able to make, 10 pounds in 2 years off of that land sale. And then the next month, they sold the 400 acres down in Georgia, but it's now located in Wilkes County for 80 pounds to Joseph McCutcheon. And then in 1797, he purchased 150 acres from Glen Owen for $150. And then I found a couple records of different lawsuits, and it sounded like he might have actually lost some land to like a sheriff's sale. So it sounded like he might have been in maybe poor health and wasn't able to support himself anymore or something like that. But he was in the 1800 census in Oglethorpe County, and he wrote his will on April 9th, 1805, and his will was probated June 20th, 1805. So he died right after writing his will. on the left is Peter Wylie's actual will, and he left $14 to his daughter Ann Lee, 25 cents to the majority of his children each. Left his daughter Margaret Nelson a bed and furniture, and then left everything else divided between his sons James and Nicholas. He does mention my 5 times great grandmother Catherine Crowley, who married Benjamin, which is, one of 2 records that verifies that they are actually related, including when they got married in 1795. And then after Peter died, his orphans, as they were called, drew land in the lottery, and they must have sold it because one of the boys, it was either, I can't remember if it was James or Nicholas, wrote in 1812 that he had received his final share of, like, I want to say it was like $66 or something like that from the estate. But it's just crazy to me that he died in 1805 and his estate wasn't fully probated until 1812, because when you look on the right here is a list, the inventory of what he had when he died. A horse and bridle, saddle, I mean, nothing major. He did no property. It was like $125 worth of stuff, which was not a whole heck of a lot back then. So I think Peter had a bit of a rough time towards the end of his life, and my guess is, based on how much he left his one daughter, he was probably living with her at the time.